In this video, you are going to see the installation of the 9 and 10 foot high lifestyle screen counterbalance system. What you will notice about this is that it is a rear torsion mount counterbalance system. This differs from the 7 and 8 foot high lifestyle screens because the 7 and 8 foot high lifestyle screens are extension spring based and mounted on the sides of the tracks. Now the first thing to note is that for doors that are 12 feet wide and less, only one counterbalance spring is required. Doors that are 12 feet 1 inch wide to 16 feet wide will require 2 springs. In the garage door industry, doors are viewed from the inside, thus determining the left-hand side of the door and the right-hand side of the door. Now let's take a look at what's included in your Lifestyle Screens Torsional Counterbalance System. Shown here are the contents of the counterbalance system. First is the torsion tube. Next is the cable, then the left-hand drum, which is painted black, the spring, the right-hand drum, which is painted red, and the hardware bag. Open the hardware bag and place its contents on the table. What you will find in the hardware bag is this: 2 bearing plates, 2 spacers, 2 5/16 by 1 inch hex bolts with nuts, 4 1/4 inch by 5/8 inch long track bolts, 4 1/4 inch washers and 4 1/4 inch nuts. Now to begin assembly of the counterbalance system, place 2 track bolts in the rearmost holes of the right-hand horizontal track as shown. Next, place the bearing plate over the 2 track bolts that you just installed in the track. Be sure to use the slots in the bearing plate in the uppermost position. Assemble the flat washers and then the nuts. Tighten the fasteners securely. Notice how the outside flange of the bearing is towards the outside of the track. It is very important that you assemble the bearing plate in this manner. Repeat this bearing plate installation on the left-hand horizontal track. Next, you'll assemble the torsion tube into the counterbalance spring. You're going to want 6 inches of tube sticking out from the spring assembly. Now, finger tighten the set screws that are in the winding cone to keep it from sliding on the torsion tube during installation. Now take the tube assembly and slide it into the left-hand bearing plate first, then into the right-hand bearing plate as shown. Next, retrieve the 2 5/16 inch by 1 inch hex bolts and the 2 5/16 inch nuts that will affix the counterbalance spring to the bearing plate. Now fasten the spring assembly to the bearing plate. Fully tighten the fasteners. There should be a minimum of 5 3/4 inches sticking out from the bearing plate after assembly. Now you will assemble the cable pins into the Lifestyle Screens bottom bracket. There is a molded end of the cable. Make sure that the molded end fits into the recess of the cable pin. The opposite side of the cable has a stop crimped on it. Be sure that the molded end goes in the recess of the pin. The cable comes pre-assembled. Be sure when you unwind the cable that you do it carefully so as not to kink it. Remove the inner E-clip from the cable pin. Insert the cable pin into the bottom bracket. Replace the E-clip on the cable pin. Make sure the cable pin can rotate freely. It is highly recommended that you lubricate the cable pin with silicone or lithium grease at this time. Route the cable from the cable pin over the 1.5 inch pulley on the tight radius and then over the 3 inch pulley mounted on the horizontal track. Now you will install the drum on the torsion shaft and connect the cable to the drum. First, place a spacer on the tube as shown. Next, take the right-hand drum, which is painted red, and hook the cable into the drum's cable entry slot. You'll note that the right-hand drum is painted red and it matches up with the right-hand spring assembly, the winding cone of which is also painted red. You will wrap the cable onto the drum and, keeping it taut, place the drum onto the torsion shaft. Tighten the drum's set screws. Make sure that you have at least 1 inch of tube sticking outside of the cable drum. Next, place a pair of vice grips on the tube as shown. These vice grips, along with a piece of tube hung on the vice grips, will act as a counterweight to hold the cable tight as you wind the spring and install the left-hand side drum. Now you're going to install the left-hand side drum. Again, first the spacer goes on. You'll note that the left-hand drum is painted black. It's worth noting that on the door that requires 2 springs, the color of the spring and the color of the drum should match. Red is the right-hand side of the door and black is the left-hand side of the door. Now hook the cable into the cable entry slot. Wrap the cable tight. Place the drum onto the torsion tube, all the while keeping the cable taut. Now tighten the drum's set screws. Now it's time to wind the spring. As you can see in this diagram, winding the spring is always from the rear of the door towards the front of the door as shown. Loosen the bolts on the winding cone that were hand tightened earlier. Insert 1/2 inch winding bar or bars and rotate in the direction as shown. Be sure that you do not pull the winding bar out of the cone as you are winding it. Letting go or losing grip of the bar during the winding process can cause serious injury. Extreme caution must be observed when winding the springs. Additionally, be sure to keep your head and torso out of the rotational plane of the winding bars. Once the desired number of turns is reached, tighten both set screws on the winding cone before removing the winding bar. For 16-foot models, an additional spring will be mounted to the left-hand bearing plate and wound in the same direction the same number of turns. Use the torsion spring chart in your installation manual to determine the correct number of winds for the size door that you are installing. Remove the counterweight tube and then the vice grips from the right-hand side of the torsion tube. Now you can test your door for operation. There you have the rear torsionally balanced 9 and 10 foot high lifestyle screen.